You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com.au. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners, to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. My name's Michael Lester and our program is Community Voices. We're very pleased to have as our guest today to discuss his new book, The Shortest History of Australia. Emeritus Professor Mark McKenna, an eminent historian, professor at Sydney and the Australian National University. Thanks very much, Mark, for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
No, thanks, Michael. It's really a pleasure to be here. I remember our last conversation some years back about my previous book, so it's good to be with you again. Yeah.
It is. Thank you. The very first chapter you call The Founding Lie of Australia, and you speak particularly from a historian's point of view in trying to write this reframing of history. You say that the collision of two worldviews remains at the heart of writing the history of Australia in the 21st century. What do you mean by this challenge, and how do you address this in this book?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in these short histories, you're trying to squeeze, as it were, so many ideas into a relatively short space. But I also wanted to drop ideas, statements like that in to, a bit like dropping a stone into a pool, to let them resonate. What do I mean by that? Well, for so long, Australian history was written as a kind of narrative of the progress of the nation state, right? So, we march through a predictable set of milestones that I think most of your listeners would be familiar with. We go from the convict settlement to gold rushes and responsible government of the colonies, and then we go to federation, World War I, the Depression, World War II, etc., etc. You know the narrative, right? And how the nation was created. And that history was kind of acceptable so long as we assumed that the 65,000 years of Indigenous occupation of Australia was marginal to that main story of the nation. And, once you start thinking about the revolution, and there's no better word for it, really, there has been a revolution in our understanding of the significance of Indigenous culture, art, history, everything in Australia in the last 50 years. It's not so long ago that school children had no mention at all in their classrooms of Indigenous culture, and that has changed so much for the better in the last 5 decades. So when you think about that revolution in our understanding, it's impossible to write the history of Australia in that traditional, not impossible, you can do it, but it's no longer really true to the continent and its history that we now come to understand as being tens of thousands of years of human occupation. So as a historian, you've got a problem. You've got a challenge. I won't use the word problem. You've got a challenge writing a short history of Australia, because its history is long. Australia's history is millennia long. And so how do you do that in a way that in a sense, what I felt with this book was I had to take the nation out, and then I had to find a different way to put it back in. And I had to bring the Aboriginal history, culture with me every step of the way, rather than, starting off with a short chapter on the history of Indigenous Australia and then sort of, moving on to the real, so-called real story. And that's been done too. So I really, when I say that that those two worldviews, the Indigenous way of thinking about time, for example, and history is very different to European ways of understanding the past, and the kind of notion of progress. These are two very, very different understandings of time. And so that's part of the challenge of writing, and it's exciting challenge of writing Australian history today is the clash of those two ideas, very different ways of thinking about the past. And so I guess, all this is a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that I wanted to get away from, right? And I really felt that Australia did not, we now, at this moment in time, did not need another chronological history of the country. We didn't need another walk through the familiar milestones. We needed something a bit more sort of unconventional, provocative, and as you say, trying to reframe the so-called Australian story, right? You hear that phrase a lot. It's not a given, right? How can we shift our perspective? Yeah. How can we
Indeed.
shift our perspective and in a way that will allow us to see different things about our past?
The book, I think, presents challenges in each of its chapters and themes that it addresses that, about how we might progress towards this new understanding. In one chapter there, where you talk about from Ubia, which is up in Arnhem Land, I guess, and Kakadu,
Yeah.
you rehearse a lot
Yeah.
of that top end history. But in particular, you focus around the story of the Kakadu man, Bill Neji, the elder, where you take the motif that history should be written the way the Aboriginal people have always lived. It's history of all time, long ago, before, lifelong, and it's very much tied to, isn't it, to place. And place-based history and storytelling is an important part of what you do here.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I'm glad you said at the outset that I was reaching towards, right? Reaching towards, because that's what you're doing. I mean, I'm not claiming that I've got there. I'm reaching towards a different way of understanding our past. And I'm really also glad you mentioned Bill Nighy, because that statement of his about history, goes to what we were saying just at the outset, that you know, his view of history is that it is also part of his flesh and blood. Everything, time, past, present, future, is part of him and his people and his country. And all of those things are inseparable. That's a pretty radical concept from European perspectives to get our heads around, But it is also, for me, Bill Nighy also says history has to have feeling. So writing about shifting perspective, I mentioned that phrase earlier, So one of the ways I've tried to shift perspective in this book is exactly as you said, and that is by moving from one place, to another place. Because immediately when we think of Australia as a continent, yeah, if we think of it as a continent first, before we think of it as a nation, then immediately we start thinking about all of the different climatic zones in Australia, all of the different environments. We're talking about cities that are closer to Indonesia than they are to cities on the East Coast, for example, or, we're talking, and so Ubia, where I go in that chapter, is in Arnhem Land. Now, for those listeners, I don't know, some of you will have been there. It's in Kakadu National Park. It's one of the most probably touristed sites in the Northern Territory after Uluru. And when you go to a beer, you encounter this extraordinary rock art, which is thousands of years old. Some of it goes back to the time when Australia and New Guinea, were the one landmass. And you stand at the top of this rock escarpment looking over this huge wetland, and you're looking towards, you realize, you're thousands of k's away from the southeast corner of the continent, which is where we think history always begins, right? History in Australia begins, well, conventionally, in the southeast corner. But if we include the deep history of Indigenous Australia, then of course it doesn't begin in the southeast corner. It begins up in the north. And we know that that's the point where the ancestors of Indigenous Australians today, moved across into Australia from the north. And so 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 years ago. And so standing on a place like at Abia, you see the rock art. You also realize that, Timor, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea are closer to you than, Hobart, Melbourne, Sydney, right?
Yeah.
And so then you start to really shift your understanding of what the history of Australia is, because it takes you away from that conventional thinking that, oh, it begins when Governor Arthur Phillip sails into, the Sydney Harbour in 1788 with the convicts, and that's where so-called modern Australia starts. But that's still, that view still excludes the history, the Indigenous history. And so what I'm trying to do is to throw all of that upside down in a way that as I move from chapter to chapter, I keep shifting the focus of the place that I begin with, right? So we move from the Opera House in the first chapter to Ubia in the second chapter, to Christmas Island in the third chapter, then to Longreach in Queensland, then to Anzac Cove in Turkey, and so on. I keep moving shifting my ground in order to try and sort of look at the country's history from a different angle.
In the chapter which you've called The Island Dilemma, you're very much again taking up the theme of a history rooted in place and shaped by place. And I think Christmas Island is a topic you take up there. But I think your theme there is basically that you feel, and I think the quote is that Australians are alone and dangerously untethered from their distant homelands. That they're, in a sense, we've grown up with a sense of exile and an anxiety that we don't really belong here, or do we belong there? Is this the nature of the island dilemma?
Yeah, pretty much, Michael. You've got it in a nutshell. I think that's what I'm trying to do in that chapter. Is to show how, I guess you can think of, if we think of maps as a good way of imagining it. From the moment that the Australian continent is mapped in those early maps of Matthew Flinders in the early 19th century, after the circumnavigation and so on, you can see we could see this continent in our mind's eye standing alone, as it was so often said, at the bottom or the end of the world, marooned almost in some people's imaginations. And that our geographical position and the fact that we are an island continent, carried with it for Europeans, and I stress for Europeans, this is not for Indigenous people, right? They didn't feel these things, but because everything was here. They didn't have senses of vulnerability or have anxieties about their geographical position. That was Europeans who had this mindset. And so sometimes we've thought of our geographical position as a point of advantage, strategically. We're far away from the world's troubles. In fact, I'll never forget, recently there was an Israeli former minister on the 7:30 report in the ABC, during the height of the Gaza conflict. And he said, oh, just as the interview finished, I envy you Australians. You're down there at the end of the world, surrounded by ocean. You're not a landlocked country, which was also a convenient way of avoiding responsibility for what Israel was doing in Gaza. But the point he was making was, that he was envious of this idea of a country like us, where we were completely freestanding, as it were, and we didn't have borders with other countries.
This feels a particular character and personality arising from the psychology that you're referencing.
Yeah.
Basically, I think you tell the story. This is a chapter where you take up racism as a theme in Australia, and I think you suggest that it's because of these anxieties and being untethered that we tend to want to build walls against the outside, and that this has led to this underlying theme in our culture, of wanting to close ourselves off, which is seeing ourselves as different, racial tension, and not seeing ourselves even as part of the geography of where we are in the region.
Yeah, no, I think that's, you put it well. I mean, I think we all kind of half sense this reality psychologically. We understand that our geography is both a point of, sometimes vulnerability, anxiety, and also sometimes see it as an advantage, right? That we're far away from things. Although as our ties with the United States get ever stronger and the bases start to proliferate, we're clearly a target in any future conflict. So I don't know about that sense of being far away from the world's travel. But those tensions have always been there, and they are fueled. They have fueled racial anxieties. You can see that clearly in the 19th century. With anxieties over Chinese or Japanese invasion. You can see it in the 20th century with anxieties over asylum seekers and the arrival of people by boat, especially in the late 20th, early 21st century. So it's it's important to realize that the arrival of one or two boats on the northwestern coast or north coast of Australia, right, is capable of causing a political crisis or some sort of national hysteria, right? In the media, at least. And that is still, I think, symptomatic of that ongoing tension, dilemma, challenge that we're still grappling with, still struggling with. How to embed our geopolitical imagination and our historical imagination in the region in which we live, right? Rather than, as it were, looking over, jumping over the region we're in and thinking first and foremost of our ties to our traditional historical allies being, of course, the United Kingdom and the USA.
And in this case, as you've said, this island dilemma, we still need to move towards, although we've made some attempts to understanding and imagining ourselves within the region as part of the region and not some
Oh,
distant
yeah. Yeah,
homeland.
yeah. Yeah. No,
So
that's true.
you do move on then to address again in a very nice thematic way, taking the land, which is obviously the whole story of colonialization and dispossession of land, and you make the statement that few Australians understand just exactly how the land was won, and that this is something that therefore you set out to tell us the story of the frontier wars and the dispossession and the massacres. This is a story you tell in that chapter, isn't it? Leading to what sort of challenge?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question because at the very moment that this book is published, there are other books, like there's one book in particular called Defending Country by Rachel Perkins and others, which tries to sort of map across the entire continent the history of frontier conflict. So, and we know that this has been something, Henry Reynolds is the historian, of course, most closely identified with the history of frontier conflict in Australia from the, late 70s, early 80s. So this history is something, again, that we've been dealing with for 5 decades. And what I tried to do in this chapter was to, I'm moving again, I'm shifting my location from Queensland. I spent a lot of time in the chapter in Queensland because the history of Queensland's frontier is probably A, one of the best documented, B, one of the most still, I mean, as much as I've read of this history over the years, I'm still shocked and repelled by so much of the detail of the history of that frontier violence in Queensland. The thousands of people that lost their lives in Queensland. So I start in Queensland and I finish in Queensland, and I move from Tasmania to New South Wales, different time periods, and I continue the focus on the frontier in the next chapter on Anzac Cove, right? But I guess one of the things, the challenge, yeah, which I get to at the end of the chapter is it's often presented, or when we talk about our history, especially frontier violence, we say, you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, it happened in so many other countries. It was inevitable. If it wasn't the British, it would have been the French." Yes, a few blemishes, a few bad things happened, but overall, it's a story of achievement and the advance of democracy and so on, right? So we hear those kinds of lines quite often, and really, look, they're just attempts to rationalize or justify or cloak the extent of the war that was fought on our lands here in front of our noses for this country. And the extent of that war and wars was across the whole continent, and it lasted from the late 18th to the early 20th century. And I don't really think we've taken that fully in. When I say that I don't think Australians understand how the land was won, they understand for sure that there was violence, but I don't think they understand the extent of it, nor the significance of it, you know? And because that is how this country was founded. And it wasn't in our heads, it was founded through things like Anzac, but in reality, it was founded through the wars that were fought on this soil. At the same time, we have to hold all of these histories intention in our heads at the one time, because the history of democracy in Australia is not separate from the history of frontier violence. The history of any history in Australia, it's all part of the other. So we shouldn't think of history as a kind of series of parallel tracks that don't talk to one another. There's the history of sport or culture and democracy and frontier violence, and they're all sort of different stories. No. They're all part of the same history, part of the same story. So that's another thing I'm trying to get across.
Here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, I'm speaking with Mark McKenna, a historian, professor emeritus of history, Sydney University, Australian National University, the shortest history of Australia. As you say in that particular chapter, it's the challenge of imagination to recognise and hold in our minds that we were a pioneering democracy, if you like, in many ways. We've created many democratic and egalitarian institutions and whatever, but we somehow need to hold this alongside in our minds with a founding history that was soaked in blood, discrimination and dispossession, completely
That's right.
the opposite. And that's quite a challenge. You do say when you talk about the mythologies that we build up about wars and memory, that we've certainly built Gallipoli as the founding of the nation rather than any other event. The death of 6,000 Australians in tragic circumstances and pretty futile at the end of the day in defence of empire, and we've perpetuated this. On the other hand, we've absolutely given no recognition to the significance and scale of the frontier wars and blood and the defending of homeland by First Nations people here in this continent, let alone miles away in some distant country. You do say that facing our history is important for our future.
Well, you only have to go back a couple of years. It seems like it was more recent, but the referendum in October 2023 for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, leaving the result aside and the politics of the referendum aside, what's clear from the research that was done, has been done so far into the referendum, is that many Australians believed that Indigenous issues were not of high priority for them. Many were threatened by the idea of the phrase First Nations, because, of course, if you think about First Nations, that means there were nations here before the Australian nation. So that can be threatening for some people. Oh, we're not the first. This is not the first. So this suggests also a deep anxiety about a fundamental truth, which I think people do know deep down, and that is they know that the land was stolen. They know the land was taken illegitimately, illegally, violently, and they know that we haven't worked through the consequences of that. And by consequences, I mean we have failed so far to recognise and include Indigenous Australians in this nation in any substantive way. The very fact that they're excluded from our constitution, they're not even there, is evidence of that. I think that when I say that, we have to, it would be helpful to have a better understanding, and that phrase is easy to trot out, but by better understanding, I mean understanding what happened in a way that is not setting out to condemn European culture or some simplistic way. I mean really understanding the entanglement of our history, that there's no such thing, for example, as Indigenous history on one side of the ledger and some other history on the other side. It's all entangled. But we have failed so far to address the consequences of that history in our political institutions, and first and foremost in our constitution.
Your concluding chapter you call The Big Picture, and you discuss two particular events through artworks: Tom Robert opening of the first Australian Parliament on Federation, and Duday's Eureka Stockade rebellion, if you like. And You seem to be telling a story here, are you? And is this an old interpretation that, in fact, it was not by accident or didn't just fall in our laps that we became democratic? We actually worked and struggled and fought and had to stand up and pay a price. Unlike, say, I think you say that the Manning Clark history saw Australians as a very derivative society, a colonial society that basically didn't make their own history. But you dispute that, and your proposition is that we can make our history and that we are and have been.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that, for people, especially Australians who grew up 60s, 70s, even 80s, people like historian like Manning Clark, was such a kind of national guru almost when it came to talking about Australian history, and he was, of course, a Republican, like people like Donald Horne and others Manning's often said in public, that Australians were colonials. They didn't make their own history. And what he was getting at was that because of because we had yet to throw off the British monarchy, until we did that, until we somehow we were sort of thwarted. And so, but he often cast our democratic history as being something that was granted, or Australians thought of their history as their democracies as being granted by Britain, as if it was sort of handed on a silver platter or something. And this is total nonsense. I mean, in the sense that, of course, the history of democracy in Australia is one in which people of all political persuasions, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, radicals, fought for in different ways. But they fought for the extension, above all else, of autonomy, of independence, of more democratic legislation and society. I could give you chapter and verse on that, but the main point is that it's very important to recognize that we fought for our democratic institutions. And yes, the British were not an obstacle to those struggles. By and large, that's a generalization. By and large, they were not. In some cases, in fact, they even suggested federation way before we were ready for it. So I think, once you see our history, our democratic history, as something not as something that was bestowed or granted, then you start to realize there's another strand of our history that is often not really understood, because we haven't come to grips with the ways in which our own British immigrants in the early 19th century struggle for responsible government, for example, struggle for an end to convict transportation. But also, can I say, to realise that these ideas of democracy and equality and egalitarianism were racially inflected. In other words, it was equality for some, it was democracy for some, not for all. And so that's why when I say earlier, thinking of this history as being deeply meshed, embedded in each in the other, rather than there's the history of racism, there's the history of democracy, etc. Understanding how these ideas emerge contemporaneously and that they are part of, each story is part of the other.
Speaking with Mark McKenna, author of The Shortest History of Australia, here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, you conclude in that last chapter that we made these steps towards democracy as a result of our own struggles and fights, but despite perhaps a Republican spirit and aspiration, we've really only begun to tread that path towards true independence and a feeling that we're not exiled but are our own entity in this country only after the Whitlam era, and we're still trying to tread that path, aren't we?
Yeah. I think so. And we often forget, many people overseas, when you explain to them that we are still a constitutional monarchy, that we still have the King or Queen of England as our head of state, they're astonished. And they're also astonished when they learn, that Indigenous Australians are excluded from the Constitution still. So, yes, we are still coming to terms with, we're still to really... Can I just say this too this is an interview about history. Really crucial thing, that our history is always going to be contested even after we achieve those two things I referred to. It's still going to be contested, but it's just trying to get that contestation to happen in a more informed way.
Thank you very much, Mark McKenna, for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches to discuss the shortest history of Australia. Thanks so much, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the time and effort you've made for the interview. Thank you.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rnb.org.au.